Are you guys ready? Do anything. I think they will monitor everything from up here. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Ellen Mortensen, and I'm the academic director of the Holberg Prize. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to this year's Masterclass, which will be led by the 2019 Holberg Laureate Professor Paul Gilroy. Can you hear me? Okay. Each year, the Holberg Prize organizes a masterclass led by the Holberg Laureate intended for PhD candidates from Nordic universities. In connection with the Holberg Week, we offer a grant to graduate students from the Nordic countries who may compete for the possibility to take part in the masterclass with the laureate. Are we on? Can you hear me? No? Let me use my outdoor voice. I can use it. Okay.
Can you use the mic for the screen? Even though we can't hear you with the screen.
Okay. Can you hear me now? It's not working. Oh, you did? Okay. Well, I guess technological glitches are part of the experience. Professor Gilroy has chosen multiculture and melancholia as the topic for this year's masterclass. And, oh, I have to go back here. I was lost in my tracks. When we say that we offer a grant to graduate students from the Nordic countries who may compete for the possibility to take part in the masterclass with the laureate. This is one event among many during the celebrations, which are meant to promote interaction between scholars belonging to different generations. This year's topic, multiculture and melancholia, and is selected by Professor Paul Gilroy, and he has also selected a curriculum for the candidates to prepare for the class. 5 PhD candidates have been chosen among the applicants to take part in the class. And before I give the word to Professor Gilroy, who will introduce the topic, please bear with me as I give a short introduction of the 2019 Holberg Laureate, as well as the 5 participants in this year's masterclass, who will give each of them a 5-minute presentation before Gilroy will engage with them. At the end of the session, we will open up for a Q&A with Professor Gilroy and the panel speakers. Paul Gilroy is Professor of American and English Literature at King's College London, but as of August 2019, he will hold the position as Founding Director and Professor of the Humanities at UCL's new Center for the Study of Race and Racism. Professor Gilroy has been awarded the Holberg Prize for his groundbreaking research contribution in many disciplines, ranging from cultural studies, history, literature, sociology, and anthropology. With seminal works such as There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack from 1987, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness from 1993, Against Race, 2000, Postcolonial Melancholia from 2005, and Darker Than Blue from 2010, Professor Gilroy has reshaped our understanding of the history of Western civilization. For instance, by revealing how its economic, political, and cultural development, usually associated with its modernity, is closely interconnected with the coastal trade routes that have been operative between Europe, Africa, and the Americas for over 4 centuries. In the Black Atlantic, Professor Gilroy shows the fundamental intertwinement between the Western world's ability to develop and amass wealth and the trade of slaves and goods, above all from Africa. According to Gilroy, this coastal system of exploitation across continents and the complex web of diasporic relations that have developed in its wake have to be acknowledged in order for us to understand the state of affairs in the world today. In his work, he has consistently questioned and challenged conceived conceptions of race and has provided alternative perspectives on racism's intricate workings in late modernity. Lately, Professor Gilroy has also introduced new models of conviviality in a multicultural world. Many of these issues will undoubtedly be broached in the masterclass session. We are delighted to have Professor Gilroy conduct the session with PhD candidates from the Nordic universities. Our 5 invited PhD candidates are, from your left to right, Tora Djúrhuus is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Copenhagen, Denmark. Anders Westerström is a PhD candidate in cultural studies at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. Lotte Danielsen is a PhD candidate in social anthropology at the University of Oslo, Norway. Branislav Bedi, originally from Slovenia, I believe, is a PhD candidate in second language studies at the University of Iceland. And Ella Alin is a PhD candidate in sociology from the University of Helsinki, Finland. Professor Gilroy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Mortensen, for your introduction. And I'm delighted to be here to participate in what I hope will be less of a masterclass and more of a masterless class. I would like to thank Tora, Anders, Lotta, Branislav and Ella for coming to participate and for the homework I asked you to do as a stimulus for our initial conversation, and to thank also those of you who are prepared to, who've come here this afternoon to eavesdrop on our conversation. I think the best place to begin, really, to introduce this topic is to start with the question of culture. And as you know, this is necessary because the idea of multiculture is a forbidden word now. Multiculture is one forbidden word, multiculturalism is a second forbidden word. These are not words to use in polite company. But those of us, who have made culture and forms of social, scientific and humanistic inquiry centered around the concept of culture can have no truck with that kind of ban. And I began my own career, in as much as it was a career at that stage, really with this tension around the concept of culture, particularly where it came into conflict with traditions of social science that I felt as a graduate student were entirely complicit with the forms of popular racism and the political culture of racism that were being enacted outside the walls of the university. That was a political problem, but it was also an intellectual problem. And as I began to research these things, I was consistently struck really by the way the concept of culture was not only conceived reductively and mechanistically, simplistically one might say, but also I think imagined to be something that could be accommodated within the frameworks of what my dear friend Ulrich Beck used to call methodological nationalism. In other words, culture was conceived primarily as a national phenomenon. It was to be approached within a national framework of analysis, and this was something that was common really across a range of political opinion. It was not just something that we might associate with the nationalism of the right, but it was also a feature of the quieter nationalism, the more muted nationalism of the new left, who had contributed so much really to the frameworks within which the intervention of cultural studies took shape. So this was a problem for me, and it was related, I suppose, now I can say also to my own experience of growing up as a kind of cosmopolitan kid in a post-colonial city with one migrant parent and being told all the time, go back to your own country. Now, this suggested to me, I suppose, a particular kind of politics of culture that had to be more complex, had to be richer, had to be more elaborate, had to be more Creole, if you like, than the more ossified notion of culture that was being traded in orthodox social science at that time. I know that for some of you coming to the conversation about multiculture from social relations and political traditions in which you never stop being a migrant. You're a migrant, then you're a second generation migrant, then you're a third generation migrant, and a fourth generation migrant. Presumably you're a migrant to infinity. It's a recursive invocation of the politics of belonging, which is used to exclude. Now, I suppose I wanted to develop a concept, a set of concepts, a family of concepts, which could expand and enrich some of the things which were being said where plurality was invoked through the idea of multiculturalism. And for me, the key concept there is one that I hope we'll touch on later because it's very much connected to the readings that you looked at, which is really the concept of a convivial culture, of a culture in which through everyday life, researchers, often with a kind of ethnographic or anthropological mentality, can explore the forms of complex interdependency and cultural interconnection that grow up, usually in urban environments, but also in other places. So I wanted to introduce a family of concepts that could stand in for multiculture, could unpack the idea of multiculture, not, I think, to not to abandon it, but to try and negotiate the kind of reactions I got when people said, "Oh, multiculture, that's relativism," and relativism is always a bad thing. So they're kind of, can I say, I won't say aggressive, let me say partly complacent, but partly also disciplinary in the sense of being told what to do and told what to think. That we wanted to respond to that, not by getting into a defensive posture which says, you're saying it's relativism, but it's not really, but to say instead, lives are lived in relation, following Glisson. What do we have to do as human scientists, as social scientists, to really open up this question of how lives are lived in relation to one another? How culture forms, is changed, is mutated, is transformed. How do people in these complex and testing environments acquire habits that allow them not to fear exposure to otherness, but to interact with one another and to grow from that possibility. And all around me, I think I can say, in the city where I live, I saw those relations and patterns, but I did not see, when I went to the sociology book or the anthropology book or the policy book, I did not see those encounters being given any value at all in the literature, which was usually a literature of assimilation, a kind of social scientific inquiry which was defined by an older era of managing the kind of involution of migrant materials into recognizable and familiar ones. Okay. And even where within the social scientific literature something of that complexity was recognized, it was very rare to find the issue of racism itself recognized and incorporated into the analyses that people were making. And one of the things I liked about some of the readings I circulated to stimulate our conversation this afternoon was precisely that was something that several of the writers were prepared to open up, particularly in their discussions of public space, leisure practices, or convivial spaces within the city. I think as that intervention developed, I became much more concerned to adjust the scale upon which the conversation was conducted. And many of the pieces I've sent you, which I'm sure are available to anybody who wants to follow up and do the reading in the background, were really oriented towards local issues and local problems and projects. And I think that scale of analysis is something that carries with it certain dangers. We can become bland, we can become descriptive, but in a way, description is the first stage, and there are lots of scales upon which that analysis can be developed. I wanted to, in the context of multiculture at least, give some real value to what we might call a cosmopolitanism articulated from below, a multilingualism articulated from below, and to break the hold of a kind of complacent cultural studies project which saw culture only in national patterns. So that's the multiculture part. Let me just say a few words about Melancholia, which is difficult to do, of course, now, because not only is there a politics of melancholia which I feel has engulfed me during the last 3 years in particular, since the vote on the EU, but I've also become, I think, rather melancholy as a result of that. And one of the things that's important to bear in mind, and I don't know how it works in your languages, is that when I tried to introduce melancholia as a concept, I wasn't just speaking of melancholy. I was following the Freudian vocabulary, really, which looks at melancholia as the pathological variant of mourning. In other words, I wanted to suggest that this is a lot less of a novel argument now than it was when I first came up with it, unfortunately, that my country had been one which had been severely damaged by its inability, on the one hand, to work through its relationship to its departed imperial past, and on the other, to work through its very particular memory of the Second World War in a more fruitful way. One of the things which is most peculiar about the post-EU vote politics of our country is I suppose, this notion of the fugitive, which is alive in it. I don't know, I'm sure some of you, at least, of a certain age will have seen the film The Great Escape. It's not a very interesting film, I think, to anybody who isn't English, because we are being forced to live in the imaginative world that film has created. If you know it at all, you may know it for the very memorable theme tune composed by Elmer Bernstein. Shall I sing it? They sing it at football matches. I'm assuming you're familiar with this. The idea, I suppose, the reason I'm making this slight digression to talk about melancholia is because I want to suggest that the fantasy of the self-harming fantasy, the delusionary fantasy of departure from the EU, for which I hold no great enthusiasm, is something that is imaginatively rendered through the idea that we are digging a tunnel out of a German prison camp. That is the imaginative extent of it, absurd as it sounds. And we're doing it to the accompaniment of some sort of ludicrously jaunty tune written in Hollywood. Okay? And I think that we, as intellectuals, in response to this so far almost unchallenged triumph of a kind of rebarbative nationalism that we thought we had already disposed of, have to do better in facing the kind of narrative power of this story of escape to the accompaniment of a jaunty tune. So we have to find ways of breaking the cycles, really, of that melancholia, breaking the shamelessness of that melancholia. And I suppose I've tried to suggest that this might be done through the recovery of a more elaborate and satisfying, a deeper kind of national history of the country, particularly its colonial phase, its colonial crimes, its colonial reach, its imperial conceit. And this takes us, of course, away from the dynamics of multiculture and or melancholia into a larger set of questions about government, about the nature of the British state, about its military adventures in the world, and so on. I don't want to do that, but I do want to suggest that that complexity has to be acknowledged, and that the conviviality we seek to, first of all, recognize, and secondly, to consolidate, might be part of a process of working through that imperial past and breaking really with the fantasies which suggest that the clock of political time can be reset to recover the greatness which has now abandoned us. Thank you.
Then we start with the first presentation by Tora.
Well, hi everyone. I'm a PhD fellow from the University of Copenhagen. I'm really excited and happy to be here with you today. And first of all, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to the Holberg program for granting me the opportunity to partake in this masterclass with Professor Gilroy. So the title of my research project is The Legacy of the Past in Brexit Britain. And following the Brexit referendum, Britain's imperial past has resurfaced as a key element in British political rhetoric. From Boris Johnson's proclamation that we used to run the biggest empire the world has ever seen, to Theresa May's ideas about a global Britain, Britain's past as an imperial power has been invoked in arguments about the future of the country outside the European Union. Accusations of imperial nostalgia have been apparent on both sides of the Brexit argument, both Remainers and Leavers. However, no one has yet attempted to fully explain the presence of the imperial past in contemporary European debate and the implications thereof. So this is essentially what my project sets out to do. And from the perspective of high political culture and the national media, I seek to trace the legacy of Britain's imperial past, but by examining how memories of empire might have influenced British Euroscepticism over the past 2 decades, and how then this manifested itself in the Brexit referendum. Professor Gilroy's term post-imperial melancholia as a way to describe Britain's inability to come to terms with the loss of empire and imperial prestige is a highly relevant and useful way of nuancing the otherwise simplistic accusations of imperial nostalgia in the Brexit debate. So in other words, this term is a very important concept to a project which seeks to understand how certain memories of the past are harnessed to contemporary interests and in the face of certain challenges of the present. So this term post-imperial melancholia combined with Britain's obsession with ideas of war and invasion as a means to produce and promote a homogeneous national identity results in historical amnesia, which erases the past few decades and takes the country back to its last heroic stance, Britain alone against the tyranny of Nazi Germany during the Second World War, a time before multiculturalism brought uncertainty and fragmentation and chaos. Similar ideas of Britain being under attack or deprived in some sense or losing its identity were evident in the Brexit debate. The official Brexit campaign ran on the slogan "Take Back Control," the key word being back. The author behind the slogan was campaign director Dominic Cummings, and he explained that ideas about control resonated highly with the electorate, and adding the word back played into a strong evolved instinct that we hate losing things, especially control. And the word back obviously also has a temporal meaning to it, going back to something which in turn can suggest a return to an ideal past that has been left behind. This sense of loss is embodied in those deemed not to belong. We all know that the immigration issue featured prominently in the 2016 referendum. On the one hand, Brexiteers emphasized the global nature of Britain as a nation that sort of looks beyond the confinements of Europe to the opportunities of the wider world. While on the other hand, central to the Brexit argument was the notion of taking back control of the country's borders, or the ability to restrict immigration. And we all remember that infamous Breaking Point poster depicting the immigrant as the intrusive presence, the embodiment of the disruption and challenges facing the country. This invites serious questions as to what this means for the future of multiculturalism in post-Brexit Britain, how this will affect the inter-entrenched cultural character of the nation. And the concept of conviviality understood as the processes of cohabitation and interactions that have made multiculture an ordinary feature of social life in Britain, as coined by Professor Gilroy, or conviviality as the sophisticated ability to invoke difference whilst avoiding communitarian groupist precepts, coined by Professor Valuan. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, so I apologize beforehand. But in the end, given the spike of hate crimes following the 2016 referendum, how does the concept of conviviality or multiculturalism fare in a society which arguably now more than ever suffers from post-imperial melancholia?
Then we move on to Anders.
Thank you for inviting me here to this Masterclass class. So, in an interview with a municipal official, I asked him what is sustainability, and he was in charge of social sustainability issues at this municipal land development company, and he was quite perplexed by the answer. He couldn't really say what it was, and I think this highlights something about the sustainability concept. Maj Essebo and Guy Betten, in an article, points to that the sustainability concept initially was coined by an environmentalist organization. Later it was picked up by the Brundtland Commission, and it was accepted as a depoliticized Cold War solution by the UN. But they also argue that sustainability always is coupled with green growth, and it has become a new frontier for capitalist exploitation. But a new mythical even frontier for capitalist exploitation. But I'm also interested in how activists engage with sustainability, because I wonder if activists can provide identity, attractivity, even solutions to solve the problems of neoliberal urbanism, maybe develop new products or new means of managing political, social, and environmental collapse that this system entails. They maybe can provide solutions and progressive values. So in doing this analysis, I'm interested in Marx's idea of real subsumption, the idea to subordinate and integrate all aspects of life in capitalism itself. And I think, but I'm also interested in how these activists can challenge the current urban regime. What are the possibilities within these constraints to challenge? And I think the article valuing the bowling alley picked up on these issues in a very nice way, because they in the article explained how diversity was used to get away with a convivial space and rectify a gentrification process. And Sweden usually follows American and English policies with about a delay of 5 to 10 years. So now in Gothenburg we see urban redevelopment projects that are branded as sustainable, diverse, even multicultural. But these concepts conceal the violence inherent to class-based displacement and gentrification. But also the article about the bowling alley also described how conviviality could create solidarity to resist these processes of displacement. I think conviviality in this sense is useful for me because I tend to be overly structural in my analysis. And this other article about sitting outside also made me rethink, but maybe there is some tangible forces here. Maybe it's just not only neoliberal rollouts and then gentrification, everyone's by, and then homogeneous communities. But also now we can work here and we can find some cracks and take back the space. And I also see this in my empirical work. I look at a self-organized bicycle workshop, and this is also a sort of not entirely, but I would say it's a convivial space. People meet over boundaries there to share the interest of fixing bikes. But they're in the midst of an urban redevelopment area, and by municipal land development companies, they're expected to provide a place with identity, value, etc. So we have this cultural appropriation of progressive values, and I think, I mean, thinking about real subsumption, also conviviality, maybe we'll see convival, the new convival area, the new urban frontier. So this is a very strong tendency in capitalist society. And it's also part of this conjuncture we are in, where capitalists can absorb all the criticism directed at it into itself. But I don't want to end with this sort of laconic cynicism. I really think it's a useful concept, and it's part of the challenge in the current conjuncture we are facing.
Thank you very much. Then we move on to Lotte.
Hi there. Thank you to the Holberg Prize. Thank you to you for the very interesting readings. I will focus in this presentation specifically on Gilroy's idea of conviviality, which I think is a good concept to think with, also in terms of the question of multiculture or melancholia. And since he proposes conviviality as an alternative to melancholia and as a theoretical articulation or perhaps alternative for multiculturalism. As an anthropologist, I think better with ethnography, so I will talk about today's topic through my ethnographic material from the township in the small urban area that I call Palo, in the countryside in the Eastern Cape, South Africa. And this is a part of a larger project on notions of belonging, identity, identification, and the effects of race thinking in South Africa. So conviviality is certainly not the first term that comes to at least my mind when faced with the racialized inequality and separation inscribed into space and division of labor in post-apartheid South Africa. But could conviviality also be found in contexts that do not look convivial or that are not consistently so? We have read that conviviality is where different groups live and dwell in close proximity and where racialized identity becomes banal and ordinary and essentially insignificant. As I understand it, it is an idea that, as opposed to ideas of ethnic absolutism and civilisationism, suggests that people can live peacefully with difference. For me, working ethnographically, a challenge then is to know when a relationship is or is not convivial. What many of the articles that we've read for today alert us to is the importance of space and urban planning for if and how conviviality is allowed or not to take shape. In contemporary South Africa, the spatial divisions planned and built during colonialism and apartheid not only remain, but are reproduced in the context of neoliberal property regimes. In Palo, the co-production between historically rooted racism and class situates people in separated and highly unequal camps of black township and white suburb, and due to privatization, they relate mostly to separate sets of institutions. Relating to this landscape, my interlocutors in the township suggested a similar theory to that of conviviality, although they described it in the negative. By living apart, the people of the two areas did not share unifying concerns and purposes which could make difference unremarkable. While the landscape is characterized by separation, there are other instances where there is in fact constant interaction across difference between individuals, mainly through labor, where township residents go to the suburb to work for people there. Many of these encounters are highly structured forms of exposure to difference, a multiculturalism characterized by structural power inequalities and what Valuvan calls spatial asymmetry. During fieldwork, I lived with domestic workers who daily went from the township to work in the suburb. This involves encounters with difference in the home of employers. Domestic work is a historical product of colonialism and was originally based on an idea of racial hierarchies between so-called, at the time, maids and madams. Valois notes that conviviality is not merely the presence of contact across difference. For me, a question then is whether hierarchical relationships like these may also be convivial. While some were unequivocally hostile and racialized, many of the relationships between employers and domestic workers were characterized by an ambivalent sense of mutual solidarity and dependencies, language about family ties, mixed with power inequalities, hierarchy, and suspicion of racism. A relationship that in one instance was presented by my interlocutors as characterized by common projects and where difference was seemingly unremarkable and ordinary could be punctuated by an employer insisting that the employee should wear a domestic worker uniform, signaling how she should know her place, or that the employer would pay health insurance for the family's dog but did not pay for the domestic worker who could not afford health insurance. In these cases, race becomes significant again, a marker of suspicion, and is seen as a guide for action, which shows, like Valois describes in his article, the proximity of conviviality to tension and conflict. Much of my ethnography contains these types of shifts back and forth. So I do wonder, though, is this a suspension of conviviality, or does conviviality accommodate such forms? Gilroy's work and the literature that we read for today suggests that conviviality does not foreclose racism. Rishbeth and Rogali and Back and Sina note that convivial coexistence is always enmeshed in, mediated by, and shadowed by colonial history and enduring racisms. My materials suggest that sometimes these interrupt conviviality, sometimes they are overcome, and sometimes they end the relationship. The term conviviality is good to think with in the case of South Africa, not because it characterizes the landscape, but because it opens up to explore social connections that are often not recognized, however, without losing sight of the structures of colonialism and racism. This focus on process makes it relevant, I think, to ask how conviviality and structures of racism may relate in different ways and with different outcomes in concrete social interaction. Thank you.
And now Branislaw.
Yes, hello. I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I very much like the terms or the notions or the descriptions of conviviality and melancholia. In my research, I'm a PhD student in second language studies, so I research on language. And in my research, I came across how local people speak to non-native, how native speakers speak to non-native people. And I do not address directly these terms in my PhD work because I touch them only on the surface. However, by doing my research in second language studies, I became very much interested in how patterns in Western societies work in regards of migrations and immigrants in those societies, especially how those affected by migration are influenced, and how the co-living of migrants with local people is perceived, or how the co-living of local people with migrants is perceived. There are probably two different perceptions depending on who comes from where. At the same time, the term conviviality evoked in me the idea of, or a thought rather, how these migrants are involved in these societies in regards of learning a language, and that means that often I could observe migrants use translanguaging, code switching, or even they ignore to learn the language of the target society, and that may evoke some kind of negative understanding of the local people towards the migrants, and in this case lessen the effect of conviviality towards them, for example. Rather than when you compare tourists or visitors to your home country who don't speak the language, so you have the short-term conviviality with them in a different manner. In regards of melancholia, I connected this term with nostalgia, as it has been mentioned before. I understood it not only from my personal point of view, but also from the point of view of some of my friends who do perceive or who experience nostalgia, especially towards their roots. And their roots, some people connect that to their home country. Some people who travel a lot or their families travel connected to where the family is in the world, so they connect, they have nostalgia towards the family, but also towards the language, because as a migrant, and I could experience it myself as a migrant in Iceland, for example, if one does not speak the language, is often perceived as the one who doesn't want to integrate into a culture. But that culture had been shaped by many other political happenings, and we can name different other factors. So by learning a language, one becomes more accepted in the society. However, the nostalgia still pertains, and perhaps this is why I applied to be here, just to try to approach this topic rather from more sophisticated point of view, and to learn about conviviality and melancholia from the point of view of philosophy, and maybe applied philosophy, if we may call it in this way, because I am a practically oriented person, and I like to see research in practice or applied results in practice, if they are of course beneficial, but the question is what is beneficial for whom. So far, so much from me.
Thank you, Branislav. Then Ella is the last one to present her talk, and then Paul will gather up all of your talks and make it into a very interesting conversation. That's your job.
Hi everyone. I'm Ella Ali, and I'm a PhD student in sociology at the University of Helsinki. And I'm going to somehow set up the context of my research, which is about whiteness in Finland, and to establish some of the peculiarities of the Finnish context through which I think we can discuss, or I can think about conviviality and melancholia more. So, the intercultural character of everyday life in urban Finland can be understood as being situated in a specific historical and geographic context. And I connect this context to a concept called foreign policy identity, coined by a cultural theorist Sanna Turoma, which colors intercultural encounters to an idea of the which colors intercultural encounters, to an idea of the Nordics being the best of the West and Finland belonging to the Nordics, which are positions that are continuously preserved and reproduced through careful cultivation. So, the Nordics as best of the West. The Nordic model has recently received attention as possible cure for many of Western society's biggest challenges. This attention seems to go beyond the structural aspects, such as the welfare state, and include not unproblematic perceptions of everyday life as well. of blonde and blue-eyed 21st century Vikings enjoying their comfortable and homogeneous lives amidst pristine and plentiful nature. This idea of the inherent superiority of the Nordic way of life is heavily utilized by the Nordics themselves, from building Finnish-style schools in China to selling hygge candles to conjure happiness Danish style everywhere in the world. And Finland as part of the Nordics then. So the Sanna Turoma I earlier mentioned has analyzed Finland's foreign policy identity as being colored by the East-West dichotomy. And since the collapse of the Soviet Union, declarations that Finland is a Western country have been abundant. A recent example of these axiomatic declarations is the conversation surrounding the Trump-Putin summit in Helsinki in July last year. Local and international media began their summit coverage by showcasing Finland as a convenient neutral ground for this meeting to take place, only to change tune soon after, as several Finnish politicians released statements declaring almost religiously again that Finland is not neutral, Finland is unquestionably Western. The recent increased emphasis of Finland's Nordicness, despite the linguistic and historical differences vis-à-vis the Scandinavian countries, builds on this intention to position Finland firmly as part of the West. Finnish exceptionalism, everyday impact. Finnish exceptionalism written about by Anna Rastas, among others. So the collective project of placing Finland, a comparatively small country of 5 million people, in the global scheme of things as an example worth emulating by the rest of the world is currently afoot. This has everyday repercussions on life in the country today when it comes to issues of diversity and how it is lived, experienced and performed. Declarations of diversity are becoming increasingly common and acceptable, with everyone from state agencies to meat-producing companies joining the bandwagon. As an example, Statistics Finland, which is an official website, lists the metrics in which Finland is the best in the world, they claim. This ranges from having the cleanest air to the happiest people in the world. And this list comprises over 100 entries of different relevance or varying relevance. So the increasing intensity of the Nordic and Finnish branding exercises in the guise of greater cooperation and even the betterment of non-Nordic areas in the world raises important questions, I think. What and who do they serve? And how does this commodification of difference, which exaggerates uniqueness and erases the contributions of the non-white, non-Nordic and non-Finnish to Finnish society, impact cultural, intercultural interactions, whether conviviality, conflict or a mixture of both, as they are lived in the increasingly diverse urban centers today? In my research, I investigate whiteness through the lens of interracial relationships in contemporary Finland, and it would be interesting to investigate the usefulness of conviviality as a concept in understanding interactions that occur more in the more controlled and private contexts as well, created by the interracial relationship, and where people belonging to different groups are brought together in settings ranging from family dinners to midsummer picnics. The way, I think you also mentioned this more longer term interaction and how does conviviality operate there. And the way these settings support and obstruct certain kinds of interactions between individuals, such as family members, colleagues, friends, each varying in their familiarity with the other, the different partner could provide interesting insights into how conviviality operates in settings where the interactions are more private, long-term, and have a greater impact as opposed to, or perhaps have a greater impact as opposed to how conviviality operates when set around on a park bench or grocery store. I didn't mention so much about Melancholia, but I think you could maybe read it in between the lines of this story. Yeah. Thanks.
Gosh, respond to all of you simultaneously. I think the first thing I want to say really is I didn't talk about the history of the concept of conviviality, and I think if I could clarify that a little bit, some of the implicit criticisms and discussion might be easier if I were to say that I see these problems that I'm trying to rethink or to prompt rethinking of as being the property of particular kinds of post-colonial environments. I think there is a general argument to be made about how social science looks at convivial interaction and values it or fails to value it in relation to conflicts and things like that. But I didn't really make that argument. I'm not sure that if I was going to look for conviviality at work and at large in the world, that the context of post-apartheid South Africa is where I would go first. So I'm no, because for me, what's going on there is a kind of blocked. It's a kind of arrested revolution, actually, and the questions of land rights and so on, and the kind of the residual. Some would say residual. Some would say dominant. I guess habits of colonial government are still, as you put it, intact. So many of them are, and it doesn't really matter whether it's corrupt ANC. How much it matters whether it's white monopoly capital, or whether it's I don't know, the Hinduja brothers masquerading as something that will overthrow white majority capital. It doesn't. I'm not sure. I am in a position to even judge or calibrate how those different options will be weighed against one another. So I really appreciated the courage of saying that there are, even within that, some forms of interaction that we might characterize as convivial. Again, it's interesting to me because in societies of that kind, and I would include slave societies in this also, the question of intimacy has been discussed by some anthropologists in particular, and Laura Stoller, but others too. And it always struck me, when I was supervising a PhD about wet nursing in colonial Brazil, to think about these questions involved in intimacy, the reproduction of racial hierarchy, even in acts of, I don't know, the exchanging of body fluids in one form or another could be thought of as inscribing or opening up the possibility of a different kind of human possibility. I was trying to remember when you were speaking about the name of the Finnish gay film about the Syrian refugee architect who arrives in the summer of Finland and helps the young man who's been abroad in Paris to renovate the family summer house under the watchful eye of the father, who can't really work out the fact that there's a very, blossoming gay relationship being conducted under his nose. I think that we haven't really opened up a space for these questions of intimacy specifically in the convivial narrative, and that's partly, I think, because the reading that I gave you didn't point to that. So thank you for that. I think that's something that we can talk about a little bit. Again, I don't want to freight the concept of conviviality so that it becomes a way of talking about intimacy, but I think we have to make an area there where we can have a different kind of conversation. What was in my mind when I tried to recycle some of the discussions that had existed before in conviviality, really, or around the concept? I was thinking of Ivan Illich and the tools for conviviality. I was thinking about the history of the Iberian Peninsula, the convivencia, and so on. And I was thinking also about the great cities of the Middle East, where at a time, in an era, in a process, in a period where Jews and Christians and Muslims actually cohabited without slaughtering one another. And I was thinking about how that rather delicate equilibrium was destroyed and corrupted by the eruption of nationalist feeling. Again, we know this history. So if that's a helpful a bit of a context, I think in the same way that we have to make a certain kind of fenced-off zone for talking about questions of intimacy and conviviality, I think one would also have to talk about war and the fragility, the brittleness of those relationships and possibilities which can be organic in one moment but then might turn out to be much more fragile than we would hope. My dearest friend in the world, apart from my beloved, is someone who's been a war correspondent. And I remember him telling me and writing about an episode from his time in Bosnia as a war correspondent there, where people had been rounded up and put in the local school awaiting what fate they weren't sure. And the phone in the school rings, and I don't remember the names in Poland, I'm afraid, but one of them eventually picks up the phone and answers the phone and says, "Oh, Mrs. Popovich, Mrs. Illich, let's give her Ivan Illich today. Mrs. Illich, we've just moved into your house and we can't make the washing machine work. Can you tell me, please, how to organize the cycle of the washing machine? Because all the buttons are very confusing." So in a way, I suppose that stayed in my mind because it suggests intimacy, it suggests proximity, it suggests commonality on some level, but of course it's overdetermined by a number of other factors that have been raised, I think, in your polite responses. So I want to say I do recognize those things, and I do think they're important. The idea that, Anders, that these notions become routine elements of a kind of corporate neoliberal scripting of rapacious redevelopment and so on is entirely right, I think. And that there are forms of the politics of diversity and inclusion alive in the world that would reduce that problem to the diversification of the 1%, if you like. This is what I call McKinsey multiculturalism. And it's a routine corporate script, and it's there in the advertising, it's there in the corporate, right, it's there in the managerial. This is probably what people learn in business schools. It's a shame. And perhaps there are representatives of the business school here who can act as native informants for us in a moment. But I'm not, I mean, I do think that it's one of the things, actually, that re-scripting of the politics of diversity and inclusion in the spine of the corporate neoliberal managerialism is one of the things that's driving people into the arms of the nationalists and the nostalgics and the melancholiacs, if we can call them that, because those things look like the mainstream of corporate culture. And to be against them is to disavow and to separate from that culture. I mean, of course, that's delusionary too, but let's be honest enough to admit that that language, that theft, if you like, of our utopia and its reinscription within the mainstream of the impossible dreamscape of capitalism, of neoliberal capitalism right now. This is something we have to face up to, not least, as I said, let me repeat it, because it's forcing people into the arms of those who offer them fantasies of national belonging, attachment. It's forcing them into the arms of the alt-right and so on. That's a big driver, in my view. I thought on the question of sustainability, I don't know if this has had much coverage in your mediascape, presumably about as much coverage as it's had in my mediascape, but I was very struck by the New Zealand government deciding that they were going to reorganize their budgetary lines so that alongside questions of growth, in fact, in place of questions of growth, they were going to raise the possibility of human well-being as a governmental goal. And they were going to ask people within the structures of governmental accountability to look at their policy developments with questions of human flourishing and human well-being in mind. And I mean, you know, I'm not, don't get me, I think the dream of the Nordic world as the Switzerland of the planet, you know, is second probably to the appeal of New Zealand as the romantic location of that, which is presumably why the evildoers of Silicon Valley have been buying up large tracts of New Zealand real estate and acquiring citizenship in the process. So I think there are a number of questions there about the mainstreaming of those ideas. Now, the issue of whether activists are activists committed to conviviality, I would say probably not. My sense of the left, anyway, local to where I live, is that the questions of convivial culture are not important, and that there is still, in fact, amongst many of the rising generation of younger activists, are much more inclined to retreat into kind of Marxian categories, which don't admit those, and the battle line then gets drawn between the party of difference on the one hand, and the old economistic thinking in which the category of labour, even as labour disappears through our fingers, is somehow going to do the wave the wand of universality over human differences, and suddenly a common being in the world, a kind of common humanity, a common life will become visible once again. And so I think that economism is really still around, actually, and for many is a vehicle for their own utopian imaginings. And I think that I don't really want to have to go back to having that argument all over again. But in my own neighbourhood, 2 years ago, there was a small terrorist attack there, and one of my fellow citizens was mown down by someone who'd been radicalized through their life online as a lone wolf into the early morning, reading the white supremacist and civilisationist content which British people export to the rest of the world, feeding perhaps these notions of whiteness that don't always have currency where they land and are enthusiastically sometimes taken up. Anyway, standing there outside the mosque in the evening of that day of very sadness and shock and so on, listening to the young activists behind me saying, there's so much white guilt here, you know, and getting quite cross and turning around and saying, what are you talking about? You don't even live here, you don't know anything about it, and you're actually making judgments about the nature of this public sharing of emotion and solidarity that are entirely inappropriate, you know. And so I wonder a lot where the script, I would actually call it a paranoid script, where the paranoid reaction to the very tentative and very moving elaboration of shared human suffering, where that paranoid script comes from. I wonder how much it's a feature of online life that is being sometimes circulated in the actual world in a detrimental way, you know? Or maybe it's just that it feeds the kind of, it compounds the lack of imagination in which people, when they encounter those moments of koinonia, of mutual belonging, of interdependency, don't really know what to say in the face of the disappearance of lines that, in the same way that conviviality is fragile, those other things are equally porous, and as they lose hold of them, there's a kind of moment of anxiety which says, oh well, it's easier to go to a default scripting drawn from somewhere else than to really face up to what's in front of you. And I do wonder, I think that the culture, activist culture, has been greatly impoverished by those failures of imagination in the face of difference. I really don't know what to say about, I mean, on the issue of nostalgia, I should have said at least we don't have to treat it with leeches anymore. Yes, I mean, the thing that's closest to home is the thing that's most difficult to say anything about. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I just wanted to, I think what I'll say is that Britain is, of course, a horrible outlier in one way, but it actually, the 3 years that have elapsed since the vote for me have told me that Britain isn't as much as of an outlier in this process of political conflict than I had really appreciated. I would have said, oh, of course, it's just us, it's our pathology, us. I said us, I don't say that very often. This pathology belongs to a post-imperial nation which has its own problems stacked up. It belongs to a country where the state itself is a kind of apparatus that was constructed to raid and rob and conquer and exploit the rest of the world, and is in that sense lacks the institutional character of a normal political state, because it wasn't designed for that. It was designed to rob and exploit and conquer. That's what it was for. And so the fact that the people who drive the Brexit argument want to in some respects return to that shows their fidelity, their perhaps unconscious fidelity to a mutant form of government which belongs uniquely to the history of this failed world system, you know. But I don't think we are perhaps as much outliers as I thought 3 years ago, because if you look across Europe, you see that there are these patterns of melancholia, patterns of the argument around political time that you described, the idea of a return to a golden period, perhaps a period of greatness in some variants, but in others a period of purity, a period without contamination, and so on. So we do see these habits appearing in a number of different places, and I suppose I can take some comfort from the fact that these patterns are much more widely apparent than I had perhaps imagined that they would be. The last thing I really wanted to say, and this relates to the question of South Africa and to the particular area of your fieldwork, was I was thinking about the water crisis as a backdrop to this. And I was thinking about the problems in the Cape with water and how those problems are responded to by different groups of people, all of whom need water in order to be able to live, some of whom have ready access to that water and others who lack it. And I was hoping, I was sort of wanting it to be the case that there might be opportunities to grow and learn and transform from the, let's put it, the place of water in the nomos of apartheid South Africa to a different understanding of our mutual relationship to the water on the table, the water in our bodies, and perhaps also, elsewhere to the bodies in the water. Thanks. Have you been drinking that? Okay, nice.
Well, we'll just open up the panel to comment on Professor Gilroy's comments and any of your each other's talks.
Well, thank you for your response. Many interesting traits. Can I start, or
Yes.
do you want to go around?
No.
No? Okay.
Just start.
Yeah.
I can. I'll just keep a watchful eye and try to be the silent witness behind here.
Well, I mean, coming back to structuralism, I mean, doesn't division of labor and classes and race, etc., race/ethnicity, maybe we should say, create all these divisions? But in critical sort of conjunctures, I'm thinking about, for instance, Egypt, where Christians and Muslims collaborated to overthrow the regime. That sort of critical conjunctures also takes away all those boundaries to some extent, and then when reaction comes, they come back again in new ways.
Yep.
So yeah, I'm not ready to get rid of structuralism.
No.
I do think that sort of capitalist social relations are not only, of course, because I guess that's one of the contributions of culture studies. No, it's not a mere base superstructure thing. There is a lot of other things happening here. But it's not only that, but it's also important.
I hope I didn't sound like I was ready to dispose of it either. It's just, how the conversation goes, really. I'm not. I was talking about economistic versions of that, not that.
What would represent those economistic?
What would represent the economistic? Well, I suppose the idea would be that be an economistic, that you would be able to recompose your language of class in a script that was given to you by 1848, and by the forms of socialism that are really haunted by the fantasy that the workers have nothing to lose but their chains. Some of the younger activists, I'm thinking here of, one of them has just recently published this book called Fully Automated Luxury Communism. Interesting title. and an interesting argument, I'm sure. I haven't read the book, I've read about the book, but I'm familiar with the kinds of arguments that he's been making and his group has been making for a long time. And I think what struck me about that was that it was really still very much hostage to a kind of technological fantasy, the side of Marxism which says we'll always find a way to bake a bigger cake, that can't answer the questions about entropy, that can't, that still is looking to technology to find a kind of, is not yet prepared to give up the idea that we have to manage with less, and that we, in the overdeveloped parts of the world, have to adjust everything in a most radical way, so that our lives will begin to resemble the lives of other people elsewhere who have no prospect or opportunity. It's hard to say it's only an opportunity, but certainly don't live lives that are at all like the ones that we've been told are the norm. So I think there's still a dream of, in this instance, fully automated luxury communism that relies on some of the. I mean, it's partly a provocation, of course. I'm not being naive about it, but I think that sense of abandoning growth. I feel like through my whole career as somebody who argues with academics, sometimes as an academic, sometimes not, I've been saying, we have to really give up growth, and we have to think about forms of sociality, economic life, political interaction, and so on that exists outside of the mechanisms of growth. That has to go. That's a starting point for the conversation that I've always tried to have, and I've always been rebuffed, actually, even by people who were nominally green affiliates, who would say, oh well, perhaps now they wouldn't say that, but for so long they wouldn't really get into that conversation because they knew it was going to. They couldn't see any way of telling people that they had to manage with less, and I think that has to be the point of departure. That has to be the point of departure. So the economistic. What to get back to your question? What would the economistic? I suppose it would say that people's anxieties and turn to nationalism and turn to the ultra-right were essentially economically motivated reactions that related to the period of austerity following the banking crisis. And that if you could take away that insecurity, then the question of their appetite for nationalism or racism or civilisationism would be reduced. And I think there's some of that's true, some of that is true, it would probably be changed, but I also know that a lot of what is driving this is precisely not a material economic, because these are not necessarily those groups, and the fancy of taking back control that you spoke of speaks to other areas of political affect, political subjectivity that an economic argument can't really reach. And within the history of anti-racist activism that I know best, there was always an argument between those who said, what we have to do is to tell people the actual facts. And once we've shown the data which says that more people are leaving the country than coming in, once we can prove to them that the immigrants are not taking their jobs and their livelihoods, then we will have done the job, because once they know the truth of that, then they will respond in a rational way that we can predict. Well, the thing is, unfortunately, it doesn't, as you I'm sure will know and recognize, that is not the way it works. That is not. So we need to find other ways of making that, if it's going to be a politics that can be informed by research and judgment and reflection, then we have to understand the limits to that sort of rationalistic, mechanistic refusal to engage the issues of affect, particularly around questions of race and nationality, which afford a kind of ontological anchor for people in conditions of insecurity.
Build on that relationship between capitalism and conviviality. I think it was this Valuvan's article that we have read, and you can also read where there was a participant in his study called Farima, who there were two mentions of white people. One of them was if I recall correctly, a white person from the same neighborhood where she lived, and how this Farima was saying how she knows how to be convivial, you know, not to ask stupid questions, not to out the like racial or religious difference of Farima, while she was contrasting her to her peers at university who were not convivial, were not like, didn't have this common sense and this ease with her difference. And that's just one example where I was wondering about the competitiveness of the contexts. And of course at the university place there's always competition, and it's, I guess British universities are very white, and so therefore it's like, and considered more white space maybe than that neighborhood where this Claire, the other white person, was living anyway. And like somehow like if you don't have so much to lose in terms of maybe capitalist, like in terms of being a capitalist body adhering to capitalism, is it easier to be convivial? And like yeah, it's a not so coherent question, but yeah, can capitalism and conviviality go together, or yeah?
Well, I think we've heard that there are particular forms of capitalism, not least those which are connected with urban processes of urban gentrification, renewal, planning and so on, that are prepared to speak in this language. Whether or not that involves the interests of the communities that are being displaced by this, I mean, obviously that's not the case. I mean, I was thinking about what you were saying about the development, and then I was thinking about the benches and so on, and in the article about space. And you know, one of the things that's happening in our city as it changes in these ways is that the public space is actually disappearing entirely, and it's being replaced by private spaces which appear to be public and have some character, some aspects of what public space used to have, but they are private, and they are policed and surveyed and controlled by private interests, even though, you know, they might be a thoroughfare into a railway station or something like that, but they're not actually public space at all. So I think that the sort of subtlety of those gradations between public space, private public space, and so on. These things have been discussed a bit before, of course, by others, but I think that dynamic is accelerating. And this is, you know, I mean, let's say that these are certain features. If we want to understand what these things are, really, historically speaking, let me be provocative and say that I think we probably have to look at places like South Africa in order to really understand the combination of features. So there are some anthropologists and political theorists and others who look and say, actually, there are parts of Europe which are evolving towards things we recognize from colonial spaces, and you know, the experience of the insecure domestic worker might be one thing that we can focus on to draw out that. I mean, years ago, one of the writers who really influenced me a lot is André Gortz, you know, who was obviously a farmer amongst other things, and he before really the struggle against apartheid assumed the what do we call it, the final after Mandela was released, but before, he was still really writing about the South Africanization of societies elsewhere in the world. And although it's not a concept that I've used much lately, I think there is something to that. If we want to understand the patterns that we're talking about, we have to look to colonial examples in order to, and it's no surprise really, because of course colonial spaces have been laboratories for government, and they are the history of colonialism in the world, not only the Atlantic but elsewhere too, you know, gives us numerous illustrations of how technologies, tools, abstractions, that relate not just to military adventures and which weapons you can use to kill who, but which forms of bond is going to be part of the capitalism that makes this profitable and so on. These things, the innovations, and these things are tried out in the colonial space, and eventually they find their way back to the metropole. And of course, some of the Victorians who were against colonialism were against colonialism on precisely the ground that these innovations would eventually come back. I mean, the culture of biometric surveillance and so on is always a really good example of this, because of course the history of fingerprinting and its relationship to the government of India and things like that. So there are numerous instances that we can identify where the colonial space has provided a kind of proving ground for those governmental innovations and economic innovations that aren't always recognized within the more Europe-centered accounts of those processes that we are most familiar with.
Topic of capitalism, conviviality, and public spaces. I think this goes well together in what I want to say, and not to forget about language learning, my area. So I remember I actually like the explanation or description of a public space which is not a controlled space or somehow organized space, but a public space. And I recall, in regards of capitalism, that in the center of Reykjavik there was a small square called the Heart Square in translation. And it used to be a public space usually in the summertime, because the weather otherwise wouldn't allow people to group outside much. So, and there would be people, all kinds of people meeting together, playing music, spraying on walls, skateboarding, locals, foreigners speaking various languages, and the place is gone, and instead there is a private hotel. And even though the space of the square has been kept, but it looks different, and it's not a public space anymore. It's a square for the hotel, for the chairs, for the restaurants to put the chairs outside for people to sit down and talk. In one of the articles that we have read, there was a mention of one person, or two actually, who were chatting about the sadness of not being able to speak English. That article describes people in London, to make friends. So they also recognize the value of other forms of connection and the importance of small acts of care for others. They said that, and if you meet a person who does not look good on the street, but you exchange a few words and smile, it feels very good. So, in my opinion, this lessens the degree of nostalgia. It in a positive. I mean, nostalgia becomes less. It's not as big as before. So even though those migrants could not speak any language of the local community, let's say English in this case, they would still prefer to go to a physical space to meet people and to exchange at least looks or smiles, to feel part of the community, which in this case, what I have just mentioned, does not happen anymore, for example, because there is a new building, new hotel raised instead of the public space. And from the point of view of language, or communication and language learning, and becoming part, as people call it often, integrate into the society, I think that is a very big minus for the local governor, and I'm not sure whether they realized it, at least in Iceland. In Reykjavik, that's my personal perception, and my perception comes especially from my background, because I'm not sure whether I would be able to perceive this by living only in my home country, because I would have probably different values. I would perceive the world differently, and maybe I would be up for the hotel because it would bring money, generate income, create space for work, capitalism. But now I have shifted a little bit and because I have been shaped by my experience by traveling and by living abroad. So that I wanted to say in regards of these topics and conviviality. So.
Anyone else from the panel want to speak? Yes? Tora?
It's from the text Multicultural Conviviality in the Midst of Racism's Ruins.
Oh, yeah.
And it struck me when I read the authors referred to the phrase "we've lost this place to other cultures" is not English anymore, and it made me think about this idea of I don't recognize my country anymore, which was prominent during the Brexit debate, but it's also unfortunately something that I have encountered in my home country of Denmark, this fear of immigration. And then the text also mentions Kenan Malik and how he talks about the story of the Merton Mosque.
Oh, yes.
And sort of that this the retelling of the story of the mosque as a narrative of cultural loss, which gets to the heart of the contemporary debate about immigration. And he mentions that it could have been told as a success story, but this wouldn't have served the same purpose. So my sort of question is, what do you think, or can you sort of talk a bit about why this this constructed narrative about immigration or multiculturalism as this threat, why it resonates so highly, both in Brexit Britain but also across Europe?
Well, isn't the victim the person who has the greatest authority in some elements of public discourse in the mainstream? I'm not, I know it's always said that the minorities, the wounded parties are the ones who engage in victimology and all of this. But actually, to me, everybody wants, in some sense, to be a victim because the victim has the greatest authority to speak. So I think that's part of it. But I think the idea of being, well, I don't know how to put it. It's not really. It's the issue of not recognizing the country. This country was one way, now I don't recognize it, is different to the one which says, or it's a different question to the question of how have I been robbed of my heritage in relation to the milk factory, which has now become a mosque, and what is it psychically for people to want to be more comfortable as a victim who's been robbed than to have to face the demand of hospitality, the demand of accommodation, the demand of the other. How I mean, these are really big questions that demand an answer. I don't know the answer, but I do think it's got something to do with the authority of the victim as a speaker. It's got something to do with the way that the obligations that follow from that. I want my woundedness in the loss of my society to be recognized. I want you to be able to address my sense of loss. I want a political representative who will mirror my loss and mirror my anxiety and amplify my loss and amplify my anxiety. I think these are big patterns actually now, and they have an interesting history, a place in the history of fascism actually, in the earlier iterations, where people were offered images of themselves as victims, and their political leaders mimed that victimage for them and enacted it in what was left of the political space that they created, often in a very spectacular way. I think that is. Well, I'm sorry to say this again because I know I said it before, but I think that is the mainstream. That really is the mainstream, because it's not the minorities who are saying. I suppose they say we are victimized. The courts victimize us, the criminal justice system victimizes us. We are victims of assault in the street because post-Brexit now the inhibitions have been lost. People are told, to go, not just to go home, but that they will be going home. And we haven't heard that for a very long time in our public culture. Obviously, it was still there, but in a dormant way. Now it's been almost permission has been granted as the boundaries of acceptable political speech have been altered. But I think it's beyond me to be able to say why the position of the victim in this white victimage, white loss, why this is so psychically comfortable. I don't know the
You also
answer.
have Boris Johnson talking about Britain becoming a vassal state, the sort of this
Yes, the same.
them themselves becoming the
Yes.
victims of.
Yeah, and actually the trope of invasion bears that out. So the migrant becomes the force in the world that completes the task the Nazi could never complete. This is an invasive presence, and it has to be met with the attributes that we know from warfare as the best response. After the war with Argentina in the early 1980s, Margaret Thatcher, I suppose her advisors looking at Reagan's successes in the States, but she made her victory speech at the racecourse in Cheltenham, and many people went there to cheer her. I've never compared the photographs in the newspaper with other more perhaps independently produced archive, because it's the era before the camera phone, so we don't really know who was there and what the character of that event was. But she speaks in an interesting way, I think, retrospectively, about how when the nation is at war, it discovers its character. And the trick for the future, the best hope for the future, is to be able to recover that spirit which is evident in wartime and to reinscribe it in other time. And this, I suppose, is very much part of the Reagan era, making the country great again idea. We'll be Great Britain again when we can. The measure of our greatness will not be an empire. The measure of our greatness will be our ability to be in peacetime what we were when we were in wartime. And this is a good early example of the pathology which has grown and grown and grown and grown in the time since then.
I have read somewhere that it's not the cause, but it's the effect which makes the history. So, for example, it's just something that I have read. For example, the migrants, it's basically the migrants that make the history, because they bring the changes, they demand, or the government demands something. So even though there has been a cause, but actually the effect is supposedly larger than the cause which triggered it. So,
or maybe we have to think cause and effect in some other patterns that are not quite so binary, which allow us to look on several scales at once and to see a much more elaborate and nuanced process of causation. I think that's the challenge, really. It's a really provocative idea.
Just wanted to comment on what you said about looking at places like South Africa. And when I came back from fieldwork, and I came back to Oslo, I thought, this place is starting to look like South Africa more and more. So those types of geographies developing, etc. Also, articulated by the theory from the South argument, for instance, by Jean and John Comaroff. In terms of the water crisis, the way I've seen it, I haven't researched it, but it has rather manifested divisions from what I've seen in conflict. I just want to make it clear or clarify that when I first read about conviviality, etc., I thought this is everything that South Africa is not. So what to me was why I started thinking about it a bit in terms of those types of relationships was that people were telling me things that I realized when I read about conviviality that I couldn't fit it in anywhere. I didn't see it. I didn't recognize it. And that's the aspect of it that was useful in some ways. But of course, it's not at all an attempt to romanticize the domestic work institution. Really,
I didn't think you were doing that. I suppose the reason I asked the question about water was because I was hoping you'd be able to say that there was an opportunity there to build a convivial culture across the discrepancy and forms of inequality in the access to water, and that really the stories that were in the mediascape didn't tell us what was being done in a solidary way across those hierarchies, across those spatial divisions, across all that violence congealed in the environment there, that is manifesting as, inequality, that slow violence and so on. So I was hoping you were going to tell me a different story about that.
Sorry.
No.
Sorry.
Okay.
I don't think. But can I ask a question?
Of course.
I'm interested in your term, the negative dialectics of conviviality. I must admit that I've struggled a bit to understand it. Back in Sina, for instance, they state, or referring to you, say that while there may be some cultural bridging, there is no positive resolution of the dialectical tension between racism and multiculture. So I wonder if you can say a bit more about this.
I suppose I was trying to. I'm not a dialectician, actually. I try and. One of the things you learn from thinking about these questions of power and culture and politics through a colonial frame is that they're not, for me, amenable to a dialectical resolution. And I've been very influenced, I think, also by Fanon, who's someone who says that the key to understanding the colonial nomos in the world is its refusal of dialectical resolution. This is what we get from studying the colonial city in lots of places. It's a quartered city. It's not. Those people, in his account, where do they meet? In the prison, in the police station, on the torture table, but they don't meet elsewhere because the lives are organized and there's no way that they can be synthesized. That has to be overthrown. Only that's the only way. So I suppose I was very cautious in proposing investing so heavily in the idea of conviviality. I didn't want it to be easily recuperable within some sort of liberal, pluralistic conception of everybody getting along with everybody else and therefore everything being fine and all right. So I tried to introduce the notion of a negative dialectic into that reading as a way to forestall what I would take to be a very trivial reading of what I was trying to achieve with the notion of conviviality.
Because I find it very interesting to what extent conviviality can change people's perceptions of the other. I heard or my material is full of this mechanism, and I also heard a news story the other day about how Norwegians are more positive to immigration at the local level than at the national level. And they interviewed this man who was very negative to asylum reception center coming to the town, and then they came, and then it was fine. But he was still very critical of immigration and against it.
Right, interesting.
So, and this is similar to like you see in the typical in domestic work in South Africa, that, oh yes, the domestic worker, she's great, but she's different to all the others. So I wonder about these types of connections.
Yeah, that there's a limit there, but it's a limit that can be moved, and what it requires is a kind of visionary political leadership, which allows people to typify those exposures and connections, and to see them as solidary processes, and to learn. I suppose the idea would be that in that encounter, in that contact zone, you're not just acquiring a knowledge of an unassimilable other whose difference was something that was opaque to you, that you're also learning something about yourself that might be useful. And I think that official anti-racism in its policy form doesn't allow for that second possibility. So I think that is the moment, that's the space into which political leadership would have to go in order to make this not just habitable but productive.
Anyone else from the panel? If not, we might open up for questions from the audience. Anybody else? Did you want to say something
I have something, but we can open it up and then.
No, you go first.
Okay, about proximity is something that I've been wondering about, and I think conviviality and proximity go together, but proximity is not enough, I think, or I'm not sure if it is, but in these studies about, for example, white parents and non-white adopted children or other non-white children, the proximity doesn't seem to be enough for this kind of deep understanding of the difference and becoming this at ease with discussing it, for example, with the child. It doesn't automatically happen. So, but at the same time, I think proximity is needed, and those encounters are needed also just for the thought processes and the questions to start to happen in your own mind before you blurt every prejudice when you meet a different person for the first time. So, yeah, this is just something that I would be interested to hear reflections about. What else is needed, and
What else is needed? I mean, I wonder, in a way, the problem is the idea that we can engineer a convivial outcome, and I suppose there are things that can be done, but I'm kind of skeptical about that, because I feel that the conviviality I value most highly in social and cultural life in my own experience has been a more organic phenomenon, one that grows in its own tempo and is subject to a local weather. So I tried to pick research to read that was strongly localized with that in mind, that was evident within microclimates within the city, if you like, and that we shouldn't necessarily aspire to a recipe for managing conviviality which could be applied everywhere in the same sorts of ways, but to give people encouragement to consider what might be gained through the promotion of convivial space and possibility. I mean, one of the things that has been destroying our country is a culture of privatization. And this is not just a privatization of economic institutions, it's also a privatization of experience, a privatization of imagination, you know. So I think to combat those processes of privatization on every level is really the answer. And conviviality means the other is not going to go away. That difference may be evident on a number of different scales, but this multiculture, which confronts you as a threat, as a source of resentment or anxiety, this multiculture is an irreversible feature of the life we hold in common, and so I think it's holding that as a non-negotiable. You know, I mean, nobody's told me to go back to my own country for a very, very long time, but I still find that if I say that I describe myself as an English person, there is a kind of, eyebrow goes up a little bit. So I think it's the irreversibility of these processes which is important, and that the concept forces people to divest themselves of the fantasy that they can live a life that doesn't involve that exposure to otherness.
Well, thank you for all your thoughts and to Paul for his elaborations on many of these issues and questions and concepts. Now we open up for the audience to, yes. Is there another microphone? This is. Could you also introduce yourself before you?
My name is Jakub Sese. I'd like to thank Professor Gilroy and all the participants. Last year, I had a chance to be part of your talk in Oslo. Thank you. My question is about the. I'm currently working on the African presence, so I've been doing that for the past 22 years. I'm a writer. I've been trying to document the African presence here. So my question is about purity and also images. Sometime in the 1940s, I can't put a date into it, the Nazis produced a movie, a film, about lots of rats sort of entering a city, sort of an invasion. In the Nazi thinking, there's a lot of images about space, public places. Scandinavian scene, there's a lot of, writers, commentators who have been comparing Scandinavian as almost a place of paradise. There's a sort of narrative being built around that. So I'm wondering, could you say a few words about the origins of this idea of purity? I think I'd like to stop here because thank you very much.
The idea of a pure, unblemished space, an uncontaminated space, I think this is really only, it's a fantasy that in my knowledge, limited knowledge, is really something that's connected to the development of race thinking in the 19th century. I don't think, there's one thing having the other present in your world and seeing them as an infrahuman being. It's quite another having a space where there is no difference, or imagining, fantasizing, yearning for a space without that difference. People have written big, thick books actually on the history of this problem, and I can probably send you some references about it. What do I think about it? I suppose, in some iterations, it relates to notions of humanity that derive from religious belief, actually, in some ways. So there's a kind of political theology of purity, which travels from mutations of Christian reflection into a fascist political imagination. I'm trying to think. It's not something that's really, in my knowledge, part of a kind of Hellenomaniacal view of the racial ordering of the world, because the helot is there in that world, and so that's not a pure world. We might go in the Crypteia out to kill the helot for sport, but the helot is there, pure. But whereas in the biblical narrative, of course, where are the Canaanites? Are the Canaanites in that space or not? And if the Canaanites are there, we have to get rid of the Canaanites in order to become what we are required to be. So I would actually want to say that what you're picking up on as purity is really a secularization or profanation of certain religious notions of what political community could be, to be part of a certain political theology that is bound up, at least in its biblical version, with the establishment of certain features of national community. But what do other people think? What do you lot say about purity? You got anything to say on that?
It's a difficult question to answer about purity. In my opinion, if someone is aiming for purity. The one is trying to apply some kind of power. Is trying to point out at the difference and try to be creative in a very ugly way. So much from me.
I don't know if you were asking about like where does the purity come in the thinking in the Nordic context or in general. I was just thinking Anna Rastas has written about this Finnish exceptionalism, and just briefly that Finns were not considered white by, for example, when they emigrated to the US, and even in Finland in the European racist discussions Professor Gilroy mentioned, so at least I think it's not something that started here, but there was this huge like race to go beyond the line to become white, and it kind of succeeded. So like, yeah, there was this competition, and Finns, or I don't know if they won, as I think in my talk I elaborated, it's still a constant struggle, but somehow, yeah, a little bit of historical.
And presumably it has a different resonance in Finland because of the history of the, colonial relationship and the complexities of that history. Because if we go Baltic crusading or something, we're going to need to be able to see those we're bringing within the realm of the sword and the cross, in a certain spirit. I mean, I know that's an older story than the story of racial science in the Nordic world, but it's still, I think, relevant. Perhaps I don't know. I don't have enough knowledge to have a proper conversation about that, but it interests me very much, actually.
We have time for a couple more questions. Yes,
Hi, I'm Ted Östervall. I'm an undergraduate of Gender and Culture. I want to thank you all for your interesting talk, but I was wondering, it's sort of a complicated commentary or question, but it seems that, there's a lot of talk about the Anthropocenic age now, right? And I wanted to ask how conviviality and maybe your notion of planetary humanism relates to a more ecological setting. How, for instance, the American biologist Donna Haraway has written about companion species and the coevolution of dogs and humans and other species. And I wanted you to maybe elaborate on how does your notion of conviviality and maybe planetary humanism relate to this sort of ecological setting? Yeah, thank you.
Well, for me, conviviality as an ethic extends to the non-human. I would say extends in a multi-species way, very straightforwardly. But I'm not really in the tribe of Donna Haraway because I think I prefer people to dogs, and also I think that lately Haraway's come out very much as a deep ecologist, who knows that the population of the planet, or argues that the population of the planet must fall by millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of people, but won't say what mechanisms are going to be engaged in order to bring about this drastic and unprecedented decline in the number of human beings. So I think my project is a very different one to Haraway's project, although I would like to think it enters into something of the same space, and we're concerned with the same things. But I see Haraway's project is really, for me, in my reading of it, a sort of hippie project which relates to the Californian particular traditions of poetry and philosophy that are produced within the northern Californian coastline and associated with people like the poet Robinson Jeffers, who develops in the 1930s a kind of occult anti-humanism that he calls dehumanism. And on the shelf of Californian hippies in the 70s, there was Richard Brautigan, and next to Richard Brautigan was always Robinson Jeffers. So these things go quite deeply into the microclimate of that particular part of the world. Haraway and I also differ, because Haraway suggests that humanism is really the source of racism in the world. And whereas I think I take the view that it's possible to develop a kind of agonistic humanism, a humanism, or in Edward Said's phrase, a kind of anti-humanist humanism, which is alive to the history of those discourses, and which does not repeat the litany of murder which is associated with them, but doesn't give up, actually, the possibility of re-enchanting the human, re-enchanting humanism in the kind of trajectory of Fanon and Sylvia Wynter and others who want to see a humanism born for the very first time on this planet that is not amenable to the kind of triumphalist version of the relationship with nature which has deformed humanisms of the past, which is divested of those associations with the history of racial hierarchy which have entered into humanisms of the past, and which are in some ways anticipated by the voices, the political imagination, which are born from an encounter with European colonialism by the descendants of slaves. And there is an argument about multi-species life buried in that, if you want to find it there. In the anarchist tradition, there's also, I think, a very different sense of what humanism can be. And I associate it, oh dear, I've forgotten his name. I was thinking on the one hand about Murray Bookchin, who is holding hands with Winter when they both arrive at the idea of the re-enchantment of humanism. Both of them, interestingly, converging on that phrase. But also Brian, he used to teach in Goldsmiths, I can't remember his name, who really has published a lot on an ecological humanism. So I know about my microbiome, you know? I understand that. And I know that there are scales on which I can think my body as being alive in ways that some sense of a sovereign ontology, enlightenment ontology linked to a seamless enlightenment epistemology is complicated by a different understanding of life and self. But I still think that the struggle against the racial ordering of the world requires more of us than simply saying humanism is the source of all racism in the world. I think, for me, the humanist tradition releases, at different points, a number of important resources with which the undoing of the racial order, which foster the possibility of the undoing of the racial order. And being a deep ecologist is really problematic within that, because the colonial history of fertility control and so on is something that Haraway hasn't really been terribly, she acknowledges it, but she doesn't say what the implications are for her own current project and outlook. Anyone?
I actually wanted to ask also a question about post-humanism and the Anthropocene, but perhaps, I wanted to ask about, since your work is so driven on the focus on the human, and then what would be the implications of the now common focus in the humanities on post-humanism and the related notion of the Anthropocene, which kind of sees humans as a destructive force in many ways. And to me personally, I'm pretty critical of that perspective. And also what happens to the project and inquiry into racism in such frameworks. And I use, actually in my project in South Africa, I use human relationships through dogs as a way to inquire into social relationships. So I've read literature on animals, etc., and post-humanism, but what I find is that there's a tendency to draw on experiences and perspectives from like racism and blackness, etc., to argue for animal rights and the case of animals, but not to, into that framework, take the question of racism against people into the framework is kind of something I've been.
Well, I mean, yes, thank you for that, and I think probably we must have certain positions in common, because I think that the appeal of becoming animal is not so great amongst those who are already judged to be less than human.
Exactly.
So, but then, you know, we need to do more work around this. And for example, there's interesting research that's been done in the last few years looking at the writing of slaves and slave descendant people who freed themselves from slavery, and looking to see how they understand the vindication of their humanity in relation to the lives of the animals, the livestock, with which they were entangled during the period of their enslavement. And there's quite a, I think, interesting archive of work about that, and that's something that I've been working much more on, very much in the context of the ecological crisis. Or catastrophe. I suppose I wonder a lot of the invocation of the Anthropocene, and this may, I hope this doesn't sound like a trivial thing to say. I feel that the appeal of this idea may be most strongly held by people who have not really thought about the environment very much in the past. This seems, you know, at least sort of random empirically, this is a problem that I've encountered, that you know, the questions of political ecology that have been debated, well, in my own formation, I suppose, since my parents gave me a copy of Rachel Carson to read when I was 10 or 9 or something, you know, so that's a half a century ago. So the idea that these things have been talked about, worked through, considered, understood. I mean, Black Atlantic, in part at least, comes from my own reading of Rachel Carson's account of the currents in the ocean and the changes in pressure and these planetary features. So I can't dismiss it just by saying that these are people who don't think about or haven't as yet. I'm glad that they would think about. I suppose the next problem I have with the idea of Anthropocene itself is not the. There are some revisionist versions in which the history of colonialism is inscribed in the story that we tell about the Anthropocene. But for me, the idea of working political time through geological time is a problem, and you know, I mean, we can go back to the middle of the 19th century and to the arguments about Marxism and the second law of thermodynamics, and you know, the sorts of arcane debates that people like John Bellamy Foster are interested in, trying to prove that Marx really is an ecologist, you know, and so on. There's a lot of this going on. I edited a book with Rosie Bradotti about the post-human and so on, precisely as a way of trying to bring these different positions together into a discussion about it, and to prompt a more reflexive relationship with the humanist tradition, in which questions of racial ordering of the world might be more prominent. But I think, for the most part, that overture has been refused, really. Not, of course, by Rosie Bradotti herself, who's always a wonderful interlocutor and someone I engage in debate with great pleasure, because we disagree so deeply about so many things, but we agree with what's important, you know. So I think it's curious to me that people don't always want to talk about the racial ordering of the world in the same ways that the history itself demands that we do. And the figure of the dog, of course, is a very useful one with which to engage this question. I'm thinking really, again, I can't remember the name of the author of the book, Dogs of Conquest, about the role of the dogs in the conquest of the Americas, which is an incredibly important kind of compendium of dog law that relates to the most vicious and brutal forms of colonial violence that are imaginable. So the archive is there, and it's waiting, really, I suppose. Perhaps contemporary developments in critical race theory aren't so concerned with these questions, partly because as Afro-pessimism has become the dominant voice in that field, the condition of the black is already judged to be inferior to that of the animal. And again, I would say that was a missed opportunity to understand the world better.
Well, on that note, I think that we're approaching the end of this very, very interesting session. First of all, I want to thank Ella, Branislav, Lotte, Anders, and Tora for being here, and above all, thanking Paul for engaging so intimately and so thoughtfully with all the presentations and all the questions that arose from the panel here. And I also thank the audience for coming and for sticking out this most intriguing and interesting masterclass. Before you leave, I just want to remind you of the symposium that starts tomorrow. You will be served food and drink like you should at a symposium, and also lunch in between the two sessions, that is the symposium and the Holberg lecture. So I hope you have the stamina to stick with us for another day and to enjoy all the exciting talks that we will get tomorrow, and not least of all,